What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and something a little lighter today. Let's talk about the most ridiculously overpowered units in Warhammer 40k. Today, we're going to be breaking down 8 datasheets in 40k. They're just ludicrous for their points value. Now, the context here is important because it is the end of August 2023, which means we are just before the first data slate update to the game, which means the balance of the game is in a particularly spicy state right now.
Yeah, boy.
So while we can talk about some absolutely silly units in Warhammer 40k, I think this video will also act as a little bit of a time capsule to the way things were at the start of 10th edition and some of the insane things that the indexes allowed you to do. In addition, I'm going to be talking about these units in context with their factions. We're also going to be talking about their faction abilities and detachment rules that also synergize with them if applicable. And as always, if you enjoy my Warhammer 40k content, please go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the channel, all that YouTube stuff. You know what's up, and let's dive right in. These are in no particular order, but we're going to start with the least exciting of them, that being the Exaction Squad. Amongst fantastic sci-fi battlefields strewn with the smoking wrecks of esoteric war machines, smote by the hands of the very star gods themselves, it stands to reason that one of the most well-equipped units in this hellscape of a war zone are regular policemen. The Exaction Squad has a lot going for it on its datasheet. One of its best stats, however, doesn't even appear on its datasheet. It appears in the Munitorum field manual, because for 35 points, you get a unit of 5 of these guys. They have a pretty reasonable defensive stat line with a 4+ armor save and a 5+ feel no pain, thanks to their medic. They also get the option to equip combat shotguns, which gives them access to an assault weapon, which in the current state of competitive play is extremely powerful. It gives them the ability to advance and perform actions like deploying teleport homers and cleansing objectives, because all you need to do in order to complete those actions is be eligible to shoot, which you can do so after advancing if you have an assault weapon in your unit, which these guys have in spades. In addition, they also just get jam-packed with a bunch of additional abilities, including Imperial Law, which gives them +1 to hit against a particular enemy unit. This is selected at the start of the first battle round, so you can see what your opponent deploys opposite them and then buff them against it. They get Ignore Cover as long as they have a Soul Guilt Scanner, and can even reduce enemy battle shock checks, making your opponents have a tougher time stealing objectives away from the Exaction Squad. Compared to basically every other infantry unit in the entire game of Warhammer 40k, Exaction Squads are wildly more efficient. They have better guns, more utility, greater survivability, and better special abilities, and are wildly cheaper, which makes it even more useful that you can take them in about 40% of the armies in the game being an agent of the Imperium. Basically, any army in the Imperium can slot up to 2 of these guys into their list because they are retinue units, meaning that for 70 points, you can just have 2 units of 5 kind of tough dudes with a bunch of cool special abilities sitting in the back of your table, doing secondary objectives and holding down objective markers. While they aren't as powerful as some of the battlefield-striding demigods we'll talk about later in this video, these little policemen certainly are protecting and serving the Imperial community. And speaking of protecting, let's move on to our next selection. For Adeptus Custodes, I have chosen the Alaris Custodians. Now, to be honest, I actually wasn't sure which Custodes unit to put in here. I could have put the entire triumvirate of Custodes infantry, those being Custodian Wardens, Guard, and Alaris Custodians. All of the Codex Custodian infantry is super duper strong. They have tons of special rules, lots of access to rerolls, and good survivability, alongside great synergies with their characters. Once we move to the Forge World infantry, that becomes less the case, but the ones out of the Codex and the plastic kits are ludicrously good. For a pretty reasonable points value, these guys have ridiculous defensive stats with a toughness of 7, a 2+ armor save, 4 wounds, protected by a 4+ invulnerable save. Being Custodians, they even have a high OC value of 2, which most other Terminator units in the game are ravenously jealous of, but the real powerhouse of these guys comes with their weapon selections and special abilities. They are either able to equip Castellan Axes or Guardian Spears. Generally speaking, you're going to take the Guardian Spears just because of the more well-rounded profile, whereas the Castellan Axe is good into very specific enemies, but that gives them a pretty solid ranged attack with 2 Strength 4 AP1, 2 damage shots out to 24 inches, and a massive 5 high strength AP and damage melee attacks as well. On top of that, they also have a ballistic grenade launcher, a blast weapon, which is great in high numbers because shooting at large units, you're going to get huge bonuses to the blast characteristic, making these guys one of the best units in Custodes and possibly the entire game at clearing hordes of infantry. And woe betide, those infantry have characters in them because the Slayer of Tyrants rule on the Alaris Custodians gives them rerolls to wound against characters, monsters, and vehicles. Given that a vast majority of infantry units in the game have attached characters in 40k right now, this means that these guys are basically rerolling against every single unit they attack, except for mounted ones, I guess, and light infantry squads that are just thrown onto objectives that the Alaris Custodians will most likely kill without the rerolls anyway. They almost have permanent wound rerolls baked into their datasheet, which is absolutely nuts for a unit that attacks as many times as they do. Not only that, but they also have supreme maneuverability, with the ability to once per game at the end of the opponent's turn, that's rules is written by the way, don't come at me in the comments about that, go back into Deep Strike and then deploy back on the battlefield in their next reinforcement step. This potentially gives them the option to Deep Strike on the bottom of the first turn. If your opponent goes first, you at the end of their turn are going to be able to put the Alaris Custodians in reserve, then slam them down on the table turn 1, and then potentially be charging, forcing them onto objectives, or just generally making a mess of the opponent's army. In either large units protected by shield captains or small units just using their maneuverability and deep striking to fulfill utility goals like completing secondary objectives or holding down objectives that your opponent's been cleared off of, Alaris Custodians are good in basically every situation and are also good at killing basically any target on the table. Like I mentioned before, this isn't entirely unique to Alaris Custodians. Many Custodian infantry can fill this role, but Alaris Custodians have such a synergistic combination of abilities that they are a good example of a super duper strong 40k unit. Now, speaking of completing secondary objectives and collapsing flanks, let's talk about a little bit more of an esoteric option, this one being the humble Tyrannid Biovore. From their datasheet alone, these guys aren't too much to look at. They have a mediocre stat line, pretty odd defensive stats, and kind of a mid-range indirect fire weapon. It does have devastating wounds on it, which is good, but a low base ballistic skill, so it doesn't really do too much outside of fishing for those occasional mortal wounds. But the real reason we're taking these guys is not their capacity as an artillery piece. Instead, it is the Seed Spore Mines ability. This allows the Biovores in your shooting phase each to, instead of making attacks with its ranged weapons, add a new Spore Mine unit to your army anywhere on the battlefield within 48 inches of the Biovore, more than 9 inches away from enemy units, including 1 Spore Mine for each Biovore in the Biovore unit. Because Biovores can be taken of units of 1+, this means you can include up to 3 individual Biovores in your army, each of them creating a Spore Mine every turn. Now, why exactly would you want Spore Mines? And honestly, the abilities on the Spore Mine datasheet are pretty interesting. If enemies come within 3 inches of them, or they run up to enemy units, there is a chance that they'll explode and deal mortal wounds to them, which can add some chip damage to your army, which is nice. They also prevent units from advancing, either starting near the Spore Mine or ending advances in the Spore Mine's vicinity, which is also super useful, especially for preventing enemies who can advance and charge or advance and shoot. But the real reason you would include these Spore Mines in your army is the fact that they have lost any ability on their datasheet that specifies they don't interact with scenario objectives. While they are OC 0, so they can't actually take objectives by themselves, what they can do is score objectives that require Tyrannid units to be in particular places of the battlefield. Objectives like engage on all fronts, behind enemy lines, or area denial requires units from your army to be in particular areas. And a Spore Mine counts for those, meaning that Biovores sitting in the back of the table, just minding their own business and casually seeding their Spore Mines all over the place, are able to farm these objectives for automatic victory points. In addition, those Spore Mines are even able to complete actions like deploying teleport homers or investigating signals. There's a wide variety of combinations of tactical objective cards in the deck that if you draw them, a Biovore is able to score all of them immediately by itself by just putting a Spore Mine in a particularly advantageous position and having having that Spore Mine type on a keyboard or something to accomplish some very technical task. They're so good at setting up technology that they deserve a job at the Genius Bar, and they'll help the Norn Queen set up her iPhone anytime she needs it. Now, keeping with the Tyrannid theme, let's talk a little bit about Gene Stealer cults. Today, we're going to talk about Acolyte hybrids, but a lot of what we say can also be described of Neophyte hybrids, which have a lot of the same benefits, but are just less interesting to talk about. Acolyte hybrids are a pretty weird unit. They have a wide variety of weapons available to them. Largely, their solid melee stats, ability to equip hand flamers, and, most importantly, their demolition charges. These guys have baked in rerolls, getting reroll ones to hit and potentially reroll ones to wound if they attack enemies on objectives, and benefit from the wide variety of support that Gene Stealer cults have for their battle line infantry. They're able to deep strike naturally, respawn with cult ambush, come in 3 inches away out of enemies, and wildly buff the power of their ranged attacks, getting sustained hits, ignore cover, and potentially +1 hit and +1 AP from a combination of their detachment abilities and stratagems. You can also equip characters to the unit to give them things like reroll or free stratagems with the Primus or Nexus respectively. But really, the culmination of all of these abilities is those demolition charges. These are a ridiculously powerfully statted weapon, a d6 plus 3 shot, strength 12, EP2, 2 damage range attack, and while it only has a range of 6 and is hazardous, that's okay, because all you really want the Acolyte hybrids to do is get up close and personal, throw their bombs, potentially kill themselves, and then, once killed by the enemy, respawn with Cult Ambush to come back on the table and do it again in a future turn. While the demolition charges are a one-shot weapon, the new Cult Ambush rules allow the unit to be replaced as a new version of itself, meaning that, under most interpretations, the demolition charges then come back unused, and you can then reuse them again later on. With all the buffs applied to them, these guys do so much damage, they allow the Acolyte hybrid units to double or triple their points investment, one-shotting tanks, heavy infantry squads, and even, in some cases, Titans. On top of that, they're also an OC2 infantry unit, good at holding down objectives, good at stealing enemy objectives, and just generally useful to have in your army. Bomb holders with little regard to their personal safety aside, it is time now to transcend from the realm of mere mortal soldiers to the footsteps of gods. The next unit I have on my list is the Transcendent Catan. This is a Necron unit and is single-handedly the most difficult unit in the game to kill. Full stop. I will take no comments. These guys pack a pretty decent brace of weaponry, including a 6-shot sustained 1 assault weapon that fires 12 inches at strength 8, AP2, D3 damage, and a powerful melee attack that retains that sustained hits 1, but attacks 8 times, hitting on 2s at strength 9, AP3, D6 damage. While not the most powerful attacks in the world, these guys are able to contribute pretty heftily to the fight over the course of the game. In addition, they're almost always able to get those shots on target with their transdimensional displacement, allowing the unit when it advances to just teleport itself around the table and set up via deep strike. Like we talked about with the Exaction Squad, having an assault weapon is also very important because it allows them to advance and perform actions. So with that transdimensional displacement replacing their advance, they're able to perform actions anywhere they want on the table that's not screened out by enemy forces. Now, all of that is pretty good. They hit relatively hard and are one of the most maneuverable units in Warhammer 40k. Of course, they should be relatively fragile though, right? That would make sense. Except that's not the case. These guys are packing a very impressive 11 toughness, and while their base save of 4+ isn't that great, they do have a 4+ invulnerable save, protecting 12 wounds with Necrodermis, halving the damage of attacks that target them. On top of that, being a character, they are eligible to be equipped with enhancements, and the best enhancement for these guys is the Sempiternal Weave. This gives them a 4+ Feel No Pain, which means that they statistically will only take 1 of every 2 wounds inflicted on them. On top of a 4+ invulnerable save, already essentially having the number of successful wounds that will continue to do damage, and the Necrodermis having the damage already, if you have a damage value that's easily divisible by 2 for that Necrodermis to apply to it, these guys are basically taking 1 out of every 8 wounds applied to them. Let's say for a 2 damage weapon, for example, if you successfully wound the Transcendent Catan, you then only have a 50-50 chance to get through the 4+ invulnerable save. Half of your damage is automatically removed thanks to the Necrodermis, and then the last damage of that only has a 50-50 chance itself to get through, reducing the expected damage from that successful wound from 2 down to 1/4 of 1. Assuming you're attacking the Transcendent Catan with weapons that are affected by the Necrodermis, this thing effectively has 48 wounds, which is a lot, and with a toughness of 11, you're not really that likely to get through them all, especially given the fact that they're relatively small and can hide themselves pretty easily from the biggest guns in the enemy army. On top of that, they have the Reanimation Protocols ability, so if you fail to kill them, they will slowly start to regenerate, which gets even worse if they have a nearby Reanimator, getting 2d3 wounds back per round. There are many armies in the game that simply cannot answer a Transcendent Catan, and they can just run in the middle of the table, do whatever they want, tar pit enemy units, complete secondaries, and kill important things, and there's nothing you can do about it. Now, speaking of beings of godly power, it's time to talk about some Primarchs, and the one that I want to discuss today is Magnus the Red. Thousand Sons themselves are a relatively powerful faction. Their Kabbalistic rituals give them a wide variety of abilities that allow them to be maneuverable, survivable, or deal additional damage. By themselves, Thousand Son sorcerers are pretty effective, but the real icing on the cake of the Thousand Sons army is Magnus himself. Magnus's datasheet is a dizzying array of ridiculously powerful special abilities, statistics, and attacks. Not only does he mesh into the Kabbalistic rituals well, being a Cabal of Sorcerer 4 Psyker by himself, which gives him 4 Cabal points to contribute towards casting Kabbalistic rituals, basically as much as 2 or 3 other Psykers. He himself is also an absolute powerhouse. His top line profile is insane, with a 14-inch movement which can be improved to 16 thanks to his Time Flux, which gives him and other Thousand Sons units +2 movement while within 6 inches of him. He's a toughness 11, impressive 2+ save, and 4+ invulnerable, 16 wounds, a good leadership of 5, and a high OC value of 6. He can also supplement his survivability with Thousand Sons abilities like Weaver of Fates and his own Impossible Form ability, which allows him to reduce incoming damage by 1 from non-psychic weapons. That is all in support of his absolutely wild attack profile. His Lord of the Planet of the Sorcerers ability gives both Magnus and other Thousand Son Psykers within 6 inches +1 to hit and wound with psychic attacks. Isn't it lucky for Magnus that every attack he has is a psychic attack? Well, nominally, his datasheet says he can be damaged, which gives him -1 to hit. The fact that every one of his attacks hit on 2s and he gives himself +1 to hit means that he counteracts the effect of his own damaged ability. So he doesn't really suffer it unless there are multiple -1 to hit effects compounding on him. In the shooting phase, he fires with both his Gaze of Magnus and Tzeentch's Firestorm, the Gaze of Magnus being a 3d3 shot, strength 9 AP2, 3 damage, devastating wound psychic power, and the Firestorm being a d6 +3 shot blast weapon at strength 5 AP1 for 2 damage. While these profiles are good, they don't seem like anything to write home about until you start to consider the combination of effects that you can apply to them. With Devastating Sorcery, you are able to full reroll all of your hits and wounds with psychic weapons in the shooting phase with 1 Thousand Sons Psyker unit, including Magnus the Red. So he can be rerolling all of those attacks, and he can even be rerolling them to fish to try to get 6s, because he can grant all of his psychic attacks devastating wounds with the Cult of Magic detachment ability. On top of that, that +1 to wound from Lord of the Planet of the Sorcerers means that basically everything in the game is being wounded on 4s or 5s, and even better if he's attacking low toughness stuff. With the ability to do extra damage with either sustained hits or devastating wounds, it is often the case that Magnus the Red unleashes his sorcery and is able to either destroy a single powerful individual target or wipe out up to 20 infantry models with some lucky dice rolls, which he can fish for, again, because he can reroll everything for 1 CP. On top of that, he's not even a slouch in melee, with a 14 attack, strength 8, AP1, 1 damage sweep profile, or a massive 7, strength 16, AP3, 3 damage, devastating wound, strike profile. Unlike his ranged attacks, these ones don't have the ability to reroll, but being psychic attacks, he still gets +1 to hit and wound with them, so he is still wounding basically the entire game on 2s. He's fast, he's difficult to kill, he's good at controlling objectives, he's good at shooting, and he's even good at melee. Magnus the Red literally has no downsides. He's probably the most godlike single model in 40k, which is appropriate given the fact that he is basically a demigod of psychic power. And speaking of psychic power, let's talk about the strongest faction in 10th edition 40k so far, the Eldar. This esoteric star empire of void-born swordsmen and citizen soldiers emphasizes the fast, agile nature of warfare to apply the finesse of their expert attacks, where their foes' defenses are weakest and they least expect an assault. Being a fast and close combat-oriented faction of highly skilled melee and short-ranged warriors, it makes sense that the Eldari also have the best allotment of long-range fire support platforms, tanks, and artillery in the game. It's like somebody just wanted to make Imperial Guard but with pointy ears, and so they made Eldar. The Night Spinner is probably the best artillery platform in Warhammer 40k, both from a damage output and support standpoint. It comes in at the relatively fast but fragile top-line profile that all Eldar grav tanks share at a 14-inch move, toughness 9, with a 3+ save and 12 wounds. That doesn't really matter so much though, because you will probably never get the opportunity to shoot at this thing, because it is sitting 48 inches away from you and out of line of sight, thanks to its indirect fire main weapon, the Doom Weaver. This is a D6+3 shot blast weapon, and while its profile is not that exciting at only strength 7, AP 0, and 2 damage, it does have the devastating wounds effect. This means that with some cheeky allocation of Strands of Fate, you can automatically apply mortal wounds from the Night Spinner's gun. Or you could just reroll into 6s because it also has the Twin Linked effect. This weapon basically has the 3 most powerful weapon abilities, Blast, Devastating Wounds, Indirect Fire, and Twin Linked, all applied at the same time for basically no reason. But even if you don't kill your target, its monofilament webs are the best board control ability in the game. There are a lot of suppression abilities in the game that battle shock your opponent, make them slower, or reduce their advance or charge rolls. Instead, the monofilament webs from the Night Spinner basically do all of the above. If you hit an enemy unit with the Night Spinner's gun, it gives it -2 movement, and that unit cannot advance. They do not reduce their advance rolls, they simply lose the ability to declare advance moves. No other weapons do this. Most of them just apply a penalty to advance rolls, but the Night Spinner is special because it's Space Eldar technology, I guess. These little guys have the ability to shoot literally any target. With a high volume blast weapon that can potentially split its damage between models thanks to devastating wounds, it's good at clearing infantry. At a base damage of 2, it's good against medium infantry like Space Marines, and with devastating wounds and Twin Linked, it's able to even deal damage to more heavily armored targets. It's a pretty good bet you'll get 4 or so mortal wounds into essentially anything you shoot. And then on top of that, you're also preventing them from being able to move up quickly and engage the Eldar units that are running away from them. Now, what units could potentially be protected by the Night Spinner? And the last unit we're going to talk about today is the God Machine that these guys defend. Like we said before, Eldar are characterized by their relatively weak defensive stats, fast movement, but close range weapons. That said though, the Wraith Knight shores up all of those weaknesses. Like the Transcendent Catan, this is probably one of the most difficult models in the game to kill, while being probably the most deadly long-range fire support platform in the entire game. The Wraith Knight has the benefit of a lot of combined abilities, and synergizes literally perfectly with all of the Eldar detachment rules. Its top-line profile is ridiculously impressive, with a pretty reasonable 10-inch movement, a high toughness of 12, a ridiculous 2+ save, solid 18 wounds, and massive OC value of 10. While it doesn't have an invulnerable save unless it equips a scatter shield, which it normally won't, it does have the Wraithbone form ability, which subtracts 1 from the damage characteristic of any attacks targeting the Wraith Knight. Eat your heart out, Death Guard. Eldar are tankier than you are for some reason. This guy has the ability to equip multiple heavy Wraith cannons. These are 36-inch range D3 shot blast weapons at a staggering strength of 20 AP4 for 2d6 damage. While it does blast, so it's able to get a couple extra shots into infantry units, the downside of the Wraith Cannon is that it's really only good into single, heavily armored targets. It's very good at destroying tanks or vehicles with that high damage value, but its low attack volume means that it's not that good into more numerous units like infantry. Oh no, just kidding. It has devastating wounds. So if you use a Strands of Fate dice to turn one of its dice into 6s, and if you roll any additional 6s, it's going to be doing 2, 4, or 6 D6 3d6 mortal wounds to whatever you're shooting at to sweep both infantry and heavily defended vehicles alike. There is basically no target that the Wraith Knight is not perfectly statted to shoot into. Maybe like some Necron units and occasionally guys that have really good feel no pains can sometimes like survive a Wraith Knight shot, but most units in the game with the proper application of buffs like the Eldar detachment ability giving them rerolls to hit and wound, Guide giving them additional rerolls to hit, and again Strands of Fate to automatically convert some of their wound rolls into 6s. It is a strong likelihood that the Wraith Knight one-shots any unit that it targets. Fortunately, as well, it has the Towering keyword, which allows it to ignore the line of sight blocking characteristics of ruins and instead use true line of sight both to and from itself. This means that if you are hiding behind a ruin, and while ruin normally is treated as line of sight blocking, if there are windows or gaps in the ruin wall in any way, the Wraith Knight is going to be able to use those to draw line of sight to you. So, unless you have physical walls protecting you from the Wraith Knight, it's going to be able to see you. Fortunately, that works both ways, right? The Wraith Knight should not be able to hide that easily because it itself is also going to be seen via true line of sight. That would be the case if it didn't A, have a ridiculously strong defensive stat line at toughness 12, 2+ save, and -1 damage, potentially even -1 to be wounded as well if you have a foot farseer around to give it fortune, but it also can be targeted by Phantasm, allowing it to move at the end of your movement phase. This means that if the Wraith Knight is kiting around the edge of its range, it can easily just step out of the weapon's range of any enemy anti-tank weapons that are shooting at it. Or, in addition, if it has solid line of sight blockers itself, it can just sneak behind those after your opponent moves up to try to deal with it. So I think that we are determining a Phantasm, trying as hard as we can to block line of sight to the Gladius, but put ourselves in a position to be able to counterpunch them.
Yeah, I think we'll do that.
A little bit of a disappointing turn for the disappointing Salad. Phantasm both out of line of sight of one Gladius and out of range of the other Gladius. So nothing to do for Salad, and he has to discard his secondary. The horrifying genius of the Wraith Knight is that it's basically able to use any defense against the Towering roll to block lines of sight against its opponent. Even if you create lots of walls that will physically stop the Wraith Knight from seeing you, that also means that you can't see the Wraith Knight itself, and it's just going to use its huge OC value of 10 to stomp around the table and complete objectives. The Eldar army already is very good at completing objectives, so it doesn't necessarily need to see you and kill you in order to win the game. And like we talked about, they also have very strong artillery, so even if you are spending your whole time hiding, you're going to get pecked to death by Night Spinners and D-Cannon support weapon platforms. Even if you overextend to try to get a beat on the Wraith Knight will just cheekily sidle out of line of sight and leave your units high and dry, ready to get Wraith cannoned into oblivion the next turn. This unit is hands down the best unit in Warhammer 40k right now, and in a lot of situations is basically unstoppable, which makes it a good apex for this list of the most ridiculously strong units in Warhammer 40k 10th edition. And with that, that is all I have for the video today. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Big thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great, and I love you. Please consider joining them if you want to support the channel, and let me know down in the comment section what you think about this list, and if you think I left any units high and dry that should have been talked about. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.